try the, yeah.
Okay, there we go, that works. All right, so thank you for the introduction. So, I don't know how many of you have seen our campus where I'm stationed now. I'm at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley. Of course, our university spans all the way from Rio Grande City all the way to South Padre Island, right? And all points in between. And we have a new campus in Port Isabel right next to the swing bridge. And we are pretty excited because we just had, this is our marine operations building. It's not much to look at, but it's 75 feet by 75 feet. It's got a wet lab and a fabrication lab and a bunch of storage and some shade from the hot sun. So that's pretty nice. Some of you may have seen our floating classroom boat, the Ridley. If you ever get a chance to go out on it, it's really fun. I worked really hard in the beginning to actually get this boat at auction and get it for our program, and it's been great. And we also have a research vessel that you might see offshore called the Vollert. It's a dive boat and a survey boat. We do our sonar imaging, diving, and all kinds of other operations components of ROVs and things like that off of it. And of course, we had to change our name, or I guess the name of this, we were first calling it the Trump View, but then, well, I don't know, we'll just say the $1 million view at this point, because we can see South Padre Island from our offices and things like that, so it's pretty cool. We'll probably also see a hurricane coming, which anyway, if you get a chance to see it, it's on the left-hand side as you approach the swing bridge. We should be growing more and more, hopefully have some actually more permanent buildings here in the next few years. So, among other things, I'm a marine biologist and behavioral ecologist. I really enjoy applied ecology, where we're trying to figure out how to apply ecological theory to problems that we've made, basically. In the marine environment, it has to do with, well, a lot of these small reefs and nursery areas for fish have been destroyed over the years due to erosion processes, shrimping, and other things, pipelines, things like that have destroyed habitat. And how can we put some back, and can we convince the animals to use it? Now I'm doing this also in the terrestrial environment. We're doing a lot of work on SH-100 on these ocelot underpasses and cattle guards and things like that. Also, I'm working with threatened and endangered amphibians. So we've got newts and sirens in the terrestrial environment, and we're actually trying to find out what kind of water bodies they're in by just taking samples of water and looking at the DNA that's in that water and seeing if it matches our sirens or not. So we can actually amplify the DNA out of it and see if indeed there is one of our threatened amphibians in that water body without having to catch them, which is pretty cool. And this is a technique that's really taking off. You can use it in many different environments, including the marine environment as well. If a shark goes by, you might be able to detect it, or other species that we haven't seen in a long time, like sawfish and things like that. So I love anything to do with fish. As she said earlier, ever since I was able to look into an aquarium, I've been interested in what fish do and studying fish behavior, migrations, and then I discovered what all the horrible things humans have been doing to all of our animals. And I want to do something about that. So some of my earlier research involved oil platform habitats, and they were actually quite good as fish habitats. Tons and tons of fish and biomass occurring on there, but one fish in particular was the rock hind. It's a small species of grouper that occurred on a lot of the legs of these oil platforms. I actually took these back in the laboratory and characterized their sex change behavior. So these fish actually start out as female and change into male. And the male is actually dominant and actually controls the area and controls a harem of females and a big territory. And so I characterized all of that for some of my graduate research. It was really fun to go out there and observe them on the platforms as well. Artificial reef research, there's 5 artificial reefing areas in our vicinity of the Texas coastline. There's one right next to the Mexican border. There's one that's actually called the Port Isabel Reef. There's a Texas Clipper Reef, which is this huge Liberty ship that was Texas A&M training vessel for quite some time. and then got reefed about 18 miles offshore, now on its side, but it's still a fantastic place to go because it's clear most of the time. Port Mansfield Nearshore Reef has about 4,000 culverts in it. And then the Rio Grande Valley Reef is actually the newest reef, and it's like 1.2 square miles, about 14 miles north of the Saltwater Island jetties. And it contains all kinds of stuff, including 4,000 tons of concrete railroad ties that make this giant pile that we've designed, and also a lot of box culverts from actually the SH100 project that got put out there as reefing material. I was like, wow, 2 projects I'm involved with, and they're connected somehow. That's pretty cool. And so the last one is the Liberty Ship Reef. It was actually the first one put on the Texas coastline. It's off of Port Mansfield, in between Port Mansfield and South Padre Island. It's about 17 miles offshore, and it's got 3 Liberty ships. And it's got about 8 pieces of oil platform all submerged on the bottom, and it is also a fantastic place. Oddly enough, not too many natural reef formations that are of note. There's one called Big Seabury, there's one called East Bank, and these are not nearly so high as the artificial structures we put out, and actually the shrimpers really hit them pretty heavily when they go on the sides of them and sometimes over them in places. And they're made out of this sandstone clay material that, I mean, you can actually break it in your hands. I had a demonstration piece, but it's broken now too, because it's just very, very fragile. It looks like a piece of coral, but when you hold it in your hand, it's sandstone, and it just breaks apart. So you can imagine what happens as these things get hit over and over and over again. So some of the research that I've been doing since I've been here with graduate students. This is actually one of my first graduate students, Andres Garcia, who's now a biologist at TPWD here for coastal fisheries. We actually went underwater with kiddie poles and caught red snapper and tagged them to see how long they would stay at the Texas Clipper or the Port Mansfield Reef using these ultrasonic receivers and pinger tags. So you implant the tag inside and they would actually ping, and we could actually determine how residency times, where they moved, and things like that using these tags. So common snook, actually got an ongoing project with that. This is from some previous research where we were bringing them back to try to spawn them in captivity in Port Aransas. Now we're actually going to be doing some telemetry work to see how often they use the Bahia Grande. In a previous study, we found that 75% of all the fish that we tagged made one trip to the Bahia Grande during the time we monitored them, which is amazing. Restored bay, they're going in there to eat. And actually you can also see on that, was it Joe Gaiman Bridge, how many people are fishing there all the time. So it's also a gauntlet to run through, and a cause for concern right there with how much those things are being bottlenecked when they're actually going after their prey items in that Bahia Grande. Hopefully we can get that thing widened and allow them some more area to passageway through, so some of them get through without being snagged. So this lecture is mainly about how do you find out if you catch a fish, what do you have in your hand, right? It's just a survey. I'm not going to tell you everything you need to know, but I'll tell you where to find the information. And I'm also going to give you a primer on what species we have down here in terms of their families, what groups they're in. So I can generalize and tell you some characteristics about them. Maybe you can figure it out on your own, because if you know a couple of pieces of information, you can go online and probably figure it out yourself. So websites, of course, are a really good way, and everybody's got a smartphone these days, right? And there are some really good resources online that you can find fish. Google Images is great. The problem is that anybody can post on Google, right? Or not on Google, but they can post a picture that Google can find. And when, if you look it up, you'll see that there's probably 5 different pictures for a fish that you type in, and they may not all be the same. Who's right? Don't know. If you go through and do some detective work, you'll probably find that some of those pictures have actually been linked to 5 other pictures, right? And so there's the first person misidentified it, and everybody else linked to it and are posting that picture as well. So that's also a good problem. Local experts, of course, are a very good resource if you can find them. There are also universities that have, if you really need to know, that have collections and have museum specimens to look at. And that's how I do my work. If I have a species I don't know what it is, I can request some specimens that have been positively identified, and I can have them shipped down. And I can compare all the features with the one that I have to see if it's truly the same species or not. Fish keys, of course, are a very good resource, and I'll show you a little bit about how to use those in a minute. Local fish keys and annotated lists are very important because you can actually get a list from a scientist that has surveyed the area and actually have a list of the species that were known there at the time. That way you can narrow down your search. If you look, if for instance you have a fish in your hand and you don't know where this geographic region key came from, you're just looking through a random key that may be for all of North America, there may be a bunch of fish that have the same color pattern, but they're not the same species. Only the ones that occur in your region, are the ones you should be looking at. So one thing you can do is rule out first a fish species group by whether it's freshwater or saltwater, right? That's a good piece of information to have. On the coastal zone, that's a little bit confusing. If you're fishing in the Rio Grande or out on Boca Chica Beach, you may indeed catch a freshwater fish that's moving out. There was a beaver down there, not a fish, but a beaver walking around near the beach not long ago. It's supposed to be in freshwater. He's gone down, it's kind of salty, he's probably looking for a new place to go. There have been grass carp, gar, and other things. We used to have a sturgeon in the Rio Grande that would go up and down, but I think it's now long extinct. But by and large, you can use freshwater, saltwater, nearshore, or offshore to help you figure out something. Body size, was it a little small minnow, that's the maximum size, or was it this big 4-foot-long fish that you captured? Geographic range sometimes. In the marine environment, this may not help because we have what we call metapopulations that fish move in and out of these populations from long ways away. You can sometimes find ocean sunfish and other things that are pelagic or move all around, or circumtropical. They may move all the way around the earth. Whale sharks, things like that can go in and out of other populations. We get a lot of input from the Caribbean, especially during or after hurricanes and things like that when fish get flushed in. So geographic range can help, but you probably want to take that with a grain of salt. So the fish classification scheme in science, of course, is class, order, family, genus, species. We use scientific names to help us decide what it is. And when you get out of species, there can be only one that has that name, right? It's the only animal that can have that name. If there are two, there's a mistake. So this is the most authoritative way to identify a species by its species name. However, we often use a common name, right? Most fishermen or fish houses or whatever are going to sell the fish by its common name. And this can differ by region and sometimes even by the next person you talk to. Some almaco jack, which is a species of jack you might catch on a headboat out of Florida or something like that. The guy on the headboat, the deckhand, might call it a rock salmon or something like that. And you're like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what that is. But a redfish, if you're asking someone for a redfish and you go to another area on Earth and ask that, they're going to point you to whatever fish is red where they're from, right? And that's not a very good name. We have a redfish that's very common in our bay, right? It's called red drum or Cyanops ocellatus is a genus and species, and that can be confusing. So we got snook. Snook can be any number of species, up to 5 different species. Perch, well, that's not a very good name, although there is a species that actually has the name perch up in the north, near the Great Lakes. Drum, we have quite a few different drum species here on the Texas coast. Black grouper, that often gets even confusing as well. If it's a grouper and it's black and they caught it, that's what they call it. So, in fact, common names are actually standardized too, which is funny. We have an organization in the American Fisheries Society that actually is in charge of making sure that the common name is what is supposed to be. But most lay people don't use that reference. So very hard. But as I said, use of name can vary. Redfish, red drum, channel bass are all the same species, right? In different places. Redfish, red snapper does not equal red drum, right? Spotted trout, speckled trout, spotted squeegee, also same thing, right? Scientific name, therefore, is the most authoritative. Only one name given to each species, and in this case, I've got an example, spotted sea trout, Cynocion nebulosus, okay? So that is its genus and species. A pretty name, and in fact, a lot of times they give some thought to what these names mean in Latin, and so you can go back and look it up and see what they were thinking at Okay, so some fish identification resources. I've just given you two marine resources here. One is the Fish of the Gulf of Mexico by Jose and Moore. It's actually a pretty good key. The key in it is better than the pictures. In fact, I met the son of Jose, who took most of the pictures, and he just was like going around to restaurants taking pictures of fish hanging on the wall because they're trying to get the book finished. And so you'll see some of the mounted specimens, and he's like, sorry, but that's all he could get at the time. But it is a very good reference to have, and it's very cheap if you're into marine fish. That's a good one to get. There's Saltwater Fishes of Texas by Murdy, and in fact, this is now free. I have a PDF copy of it. It's got silhouettes and drawings of fish, and if you want a copy, I can give you a PDF copy of it because they were not able to publish it. You can only give it for free because of the copyright issues. So Fish of the Gulf Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico by Robbins. Of course, this is a much more broad area to cover, the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. And so the fish in there's quite a few more fish, and you could get confused, but you also have a very comprehensive book that actually has another way to look at the fish other than these two keys. They actually highlight like the coloration of the fins and spots on the fins in drawings that are very helpful if you're trying to narrow down one of your decisions. And of course, electronic resources such as FishBase. Okay, if you really want to get nerdy about fish, you can go to fishbase.org, and that is actually the most authoritative reference that we have for fish to date. It's worldwide. If you want to know information about where the fish occurs, what it eats, any kind of scientific data it might have associated with it, you can find that on FishBase by searching it. So you can really nerd out if you want to. And then you've got other internet searches, but my rule of thumb is if you're going to use the internet to find your fish, use 3 unrelated resources to confirm what you have. And that's true for almost anything you find on the internet if you're looking at the factoid. Because if you just use one, it's probably going to be linked to 3 others, and maybe the first person that wrote it down was wrong. So better to find confirmation from 3 unrelated sites. Okay, freshwater fish. The Texas Academy of Sciences and now University of Texas at Austin actually have an online key, an online resource for all of their inventory fish. The Hub's fish key is the most authoritative for Texas, where he went around all the way, through all of the distributaries and tributaries and rivers and lakes in Texas and found all the fish that he could find of different species and cataloged them and made a key for them, showed where they were occurring and which drainages and things like that. And so it's a very good, Hub's fish key is a very good reference for fish, especially if you want to narrow it down by region, because he has them listed by like the Rio Grande Basin, all of that. So if you want to look for a freshwater fish from there, it's likely in that list, so you don't have to go any further, and that list is much smaller than all of Texas. Another really cool resource is something done by Texas Parks and Wildlife. It's stored on the Texas A&M website, and I always laugh because it's still got the reference. It's not in the name anymore, but it was like cold fusion at Texas A&M University. .edu, of course, from that cold fusion results that they had some time ago. But anyway, this one's got fish, crabs, shrimp, mollusks, miscellaneous invertebrates, even vegetation keys. And so you can go, and they've got a lot of picture keys. A lot of these animals are dead that they have on there, but they're are sitting on a board or something. But it's really good because they've got a comprehensive list of all these kinds of marine creatures. So you see something crawling in your shoe once you get back to the beach, you figure out what kind of crab you have, things like that. Or you pick up a cool shell, you want to know what it is, this is a good reference to use for that. And that's just, if you just type in Texas marine species in Google, it'll come right up. Okay, and so this is the Hub's key. One good thing about these keys, when you first get them, there's a preface, and that might actually tell you what the purpose of the book was, what the region covered, and things like that. It's a very good idea to read that information to make sure that your key or your checklist is from the right area. And actually, the second author on here is Robert Edwards, who is actually a previous faculty member of UT-RGV that just retired. Very good freshwater fish expert. Okay, so now we get to freshwater and saltwater fish. Well, what exactly is the difference between a freshwater and a saltwater fish? Well, physiologically, actually quite a bit. Some fish can handle both environments, but Freshwater fish must retain as many minerals as they can because they're constantly being diluted by the freshwater around them. It's constantly trying to suck up all those minerals, so they have to be quite impermeable if they can, and they've got to keep all those minerals in. Saltwater fish, on the other hand, must drink and urinate almost constantly, right, to flush out the waste products and gain enough water, because the water is constantly leaving their bodies. So we've got a difference there. And in fact, some of the, I don't know how many of you have ever caught a pinfish before. Pinfish is also called a piggy perch that you might find on the coast, use them for bait sometimes or for kids fishing tournaments. But they actually are really what we call euryhaline. They can actually be thrown in a vat of freshwater or saltwater and back and forth, and they can actually osmoregulate and change their physiology very, very quickly, which is pretty incredible. And if you imagine, some of these fish do have to do that when they're stuck in tide pools and things like that, or the Bahia Grande, or other places where you might get 2 inches of rain in an hour or something and have the whole area become very fresh or evaporate and become very salty. So euryhaline is a term for a fish that can withstand a wide variety of salinities. So most fish in coastal bays and the coastal environment have to be euryhaline. They have to be able to switch and either be a freshwater or a saltwater fish fairly quickly or they die. On the other hand, stenohaline are fish that have a narrow range of salinity tolerance, such as freshwater fish from lakes, right? Or open ocean fish like tuna and other things that stay offshore. They just can't handle a very low salinities or they will perish. And why would they? They're out in a buffered environment way offshore, no problem. So fish are also poikilothermic, which means they have a body temperature that varies with the temperature of their surrounding environment, and they actually can change behaviorally and raise or lower their temperature to some degree. So you might find fish, if you're in a lake or even offshore, you might find them up at the surface, almost sunning themselves, trying to raise their body temperature, or staying in a different layer of the water column to either stay cooler or warmer. And that's why we call them poikilothermic, because they don't just stay there and stay with the temperature of the water. They usually try to actively change it by modifying their behavior. Problem is that metabolic requirements go way up with temperature. That's why, to a certain degree, fishing gets better as temperature goes up. Okay, and to a certain point, when it gets really, really hot, they just can't even function very well because their metabolism is so high. They almost have to cut their losses and just shut off and try to go find someplace cool to sit. So fish can withstand some extreme conditions, very low dissolved oxygen levels. Some fish can actually come up on land and actually respirate with air. So this is a mud skipper and some species of catfish. High temperatures, there's some fish that can be 100 degrees Fahrenheit water, some pupfish in some of these river and spring systems. Extreme toxin levels, it's amazing what they can handle. You probably don't want to eat them afterwards. But, pure water all the way up to 100 parts per 1,000 seawater and even higher in the Bahia Grande whenever they first flooded it. Some of these same fish, the pupfish, can handle some really, really high strength seawater. And I've got an example of one species that lives in the bay that can handle some pretty extreme conditions itself, the red drum. So at the Marine Science Institute in Port Aransas, a postdoctoral researcher actually went during fall when the red drum settlement peak occurs. So this is when these fish spawn offshore and then all these little larvae, the fertilized eggs, actually go into the passes and settle in these seagrass bed areas, right? So they come in through here, the red drums spawn out here, eggs float around for a while, they hatch, and after they hatch, the fish kind of float back and forth with the tides and make their way back in and settle in these seagrass beds and grow really fast. However, in these bays, they've got a problem. They've got a big competitor that can outcompete them sometimes. What is that competitor? No, it's seagrass. Actually, think about it. Well, so in the when plants are photosynthesizing, what do they do at night? They make sugars and they use it, and they respire just like every other animal did, right? Every other animal around them is doing that. So the plants are also respiring and making ATP and respiring and creating carbon dioxide using oxygen. So in these bays, the oxygen levels can go way down. And so what Rafa did was he measured dissolved oxygen, pH, salinity, and temperature in these areas every 30 minutes at 3 stations: inlet, seagrass 1, and seagrass 2. And here are the data. You see temperature at the 3 places is similar, but you can see the air temperature here goes really low when the cold fronts come through, and this red line, the inlet, starts going down, and the seagrass bed also starts dipping down, and even lower here, right? Dissolved oxygen, look at this pattern. This is the inlet staying constant, seagrass bed going up and down. And where is it going down to? It's going down to about 2 milligrams per liter, which actually in the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is a hypoxic area, so that dead zone often does this, drops down. It doesn't usually drop down to 0, but anything below about 3 milligrams per liter or so is quite deadly for some fish. However, these little red drum have an adaptation to allow them to survive it. And the reason we know this is respiration and competition between other things respiring is we can also look at this pH level, which, as you know, if you bubble a bunch of carbon dioxide in the water, it becomes carbonic acid, which lowers the pH. And you can see right along with these dissolved oxygen lows, the pH is also dropping down, right? A lot of respiration going on there. So these little red drum are actually in there surviving even these really low dissolved oxygen levels, and we think it's an adaptation because bigger fish are going to eat them. Even large red drum would eat them. When the large red drum and all the other large fish leave at night out of these bays, otherwise they're going to suffocate. And these little fish, since they're so small, don't need nearly so much oxygen per body size. So size is also something that's very interesting, especially with marine fish. This is a blue marlin.
Wow.
They look like a full-size marlin when they're juveniles. Cool. This is actually a picture from a colleague of mine at Texas A&M Galveston, Jay Rooker. He studies billfish out there in the out off the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico, and they find these out there just netting them up at night. It's really cool. I've been on some of the cruises, and the sailfish will come up only this big and lift its sail up and be going after little invertebrates in the lights.
That is hilarious.
So, and you have to remember that almost all the marine fish that we have, if they're not live birth or, sharks, of course, contribute a lot more energy, but a lot of these fish have eggs that are less than 1 millimeter in diameter when they spawn, even marlin. And these things can get to be 1,000 pounds. So it's amazing how small they can start off and grow that from that size up to very large. So how many species of fish are there? Well, to date, there are 34,100 known species of fish worldwide. Gulf of Mexico has about 539 species, with 100 of them being common. And the Rio Grande has about 104 species, with only 20 of them common to all parts. Rio Grande is a shadow of what it once was. It doesn't have those ebb and flood periods anymore. We've really controlled it, pumped almost all the water out of it. And so a lot of the species that have to have that river gone extinct, or they just don't occur in this area anymore, they're locally extirpated. So how are fish distributed around the earth? And this is an interesting question because saltwater covers 70% of the surface. Freshwater covers about less than 1% of the surface. However, marine fish species have 58.2% of all known species. Freshwater fish are 41.2%, and both those ones that go from both habitats are 0.6%. Why is that? Why are there almost as many in the freshwater environment, even though the freshwater is only less than 1% of the surface? Think of why that might be. It may take evolution. What is about freshwater and saltwater that's that different? Okay, so it's because of isolation. So all these freshwater environments we have, if we haven't screwed it up and dredged a channel into it or something like that, like we've done in some of the Great Lakes, they're not connected. And so all these fish that got deposited in these freshwater environments long ago, whenever maybe they were connected, have evolved over time to their, to pick a mate, to adapt to the local environment, and And so we've got tons and tons of species that evolve in lakes rather than in the marine environment where everything seems to be connected, right? There's not very much isolation going on in the marine environment. A chance hurricane can push things very far, right? There are some isolated zones or what I call meta-populations because they, you might get an individual moving in every 100 years or something like that, but that's still not isolation. And so here's the figure of the percentages of recent fish species. You can see diadromous, epipelagic, deep benthic, 6.4%. And a lot of these deep pelagics, we're still adding species here because we just don't know very much about the deep pelagic zone. Very cold, almost freezing down there, and there's no light. So how are we going to find it? So fish have adapted to a wide variety of conditions. As I was saying, dissolved oxygen is one of them. Air has about 210 milligram per liter of oxygen. Freshwater has about 14 milligrams per liter at most. That's all it can hold. Saltwater has 8 milligram per liter. So you can see saltwater fish have to pull in a lot more oxygen per volume than freshwater fish do. And of course, air breathing, we don't care. We have a surplus of oxygen almost all the time unless we're stuck inside a telephone booth. But as you can see, there has to be some physiological changes as well going on in the surface area and things like that to get enough oxygen. And it's not very far from 2 milligram per liter to 8, right? There's not a big range there for them to live in as well. Okay, so fish reproduce in different ways in these environments. In external fertilization is a generalization, so they typically broadcast spawn, so they spread their eggs around and their gametes float off, and the parents never see their babies again, except for maybe when they want to eat them, right? Freshwater fish usually have sticky eggs that sink to the bottom. There are a few species that are actually really threatened or on the verge of extinction that actually have pelagic eggs that float, like the Rio Grande silvery minnow. When we dam the rivers, nothing gets by, right? But these sticky eggs work pretty well. They have a fast hatch rate and almost direct development, which means they're already ready to eat usually when they hatch. Gar are a good example of this. As soon as they hatch, they can eat whoever's next to hatch, which is also a problem with human culture. Marine fish eggs, however, are very, very complicated because they do most of their development outside the egg. So they hatch and they can't see, they don't even have a mouth. And they're very, very small. As I said, they'd be 1 millimeter in size. They have a prolonged larval stage and a development, and they typically, when they're broadcast, they broadcast 100,000 eggs at a time. Some of those get fertilized and only 0.001% of them even make it past hatching. So it's like shotgun blast and forget it. Whereas if you've probably seen videos about salmon where they lay their sticky eggs, and there aren't very many of them. They're really big. There's a lot of nutrients in there, and when they hatch, they're ready to go. Okay, so fish are organized by class, order, family, genus, species. Most people prefer to call them by their common names. Actually, that's in the wrong order. So in freshwater, we have 268 species in Texas. More than 5% of native species have been lost, which is very concerning, right? In saltwater, we have a total of about 3,000 species that you might be able to find. So it's a much broader net you have to cast when you're trying to identify a saltwater species, especially offshore. Okay, so color is a good indicator as long as it's black for identifying fish, because any of these other colors like yellow or orange or red usually fade away right after you get them in your hand, and they're almost certainly not the same color they were when they were in the environment. So color fades really quickly, and keys don't usually use color very often unless it's a melanophore like this black pattern here, which will stay long after death, and like on the eye spots on a red drum as well. So just remember that. If you catch them quick enough, you might be able to see the color, but that may not even be what it was in its environment. And so our classification scheme was class. In this case, I'm looking at a red drum. It's Actinopterygii, rayfin fishes. Order, Perciformes, which actually means perch-like fishes. And you can see that red drum kind of have a perch-like mouth. Family, Cyanidae, or the drums. Redfish, croaker, spotted trout, sand trout, whiting are all in this group. genus Cyanops, and then as I said, there can only be one in this species, Ocellatus. So there could be more than one Cyanops, and there are, but there can only be one called Cyanops ocellatus, which is the red drum here, and all throughout the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic seaboard. Okay, here is a diagram of key features that you might want to know on a fish. Okay, and this is actually from the key. This is a side view of perch-like fish, as you can tell. One thing that's very prominent in a lot of fish is the lateral line. That's a sensory pore system that goes right here. All the scales on a lateral line have a hole in them. And so oftentimes in a key, if you have to split between two different members of a genus, you have to count those scales in order to figure out which one you have, which is a pain. Dorsal fin is up here, right? And we have a dorsal spine, and there's a dorsal rays here. Sometimes you've got two dorsal fins if they're separated. So the first and second dorsal fin that may help you. The caudal fin and the caudal peduncle are the back end of the fish, where the tail is. Caudal peduncle is the narrowed region there, and the caudal fin, of course, is the back part. The paired fins, of course, are the pectoral fins, the pelvic fins, and then you've got a single anal fin. So you can remember pectoral and pelvic by just looking at yourself, make chicken wings. Where are these on the fish? You know, and the pelvis is down here, so you think of that. On very advanced fish or very mobile fish, the pelvic fins may be shifted way forward, but they're always the lower fins to look for. You've got the operculum, which is the gill covering, and all the bony fish typically have an operculum. And then you've got brachial-stegal rays, which is that membranous, I don't know how many of you caught a bass or even a red drum. You can actually see those little support structures, the kind of membranous area right behind the operculum. Those are the brachial-stegal rays. And those actually is sometimes a good feature to key out fish as well. There's a preoperculum here, which is usually filled with spines or cutting things for fighting with other fish and as protection, or even wedging themselves into rocks. So fish that do a lot of hiding on the bottom might have some really, really sharp operculum and preopercle. So on all these fin structures, they can have spines and rays. Rays are the soft, fleshy, branching structures. Spines typically have one, they're one unit and they're hard and usually can poke you. Okay, so in any good key, you'll have a diagram that will tell you what they mean by all of these structures that you can look at first to make sure you're looking at the right thing on the fish. Okay, so in a fish key, you typically have what's called a dichotomous key, okay, or a couplet of questions that you have to answer to get to the next point. It's kind of like one of those choose your own adventure books or something like that, right? So you might use this to identify a fish to species, and it emphasizes recognizable difference between the species, however a human made it, and so there can also be some problems with it or point of view. It's time consuming, and sometimes you don't get to the right answer. And species traits are variable, and exact statements are really hard to apply to some of these fish species because they can change depending on the environment they're in. So here's an example just from a vehicle familiar to everyone, right, that we can use as a good example of how you would work through a key. And so question one is propelled by internal combustion engine or propelled by muscular effort by the rider. Okay, we know where we're going here. Let's just say, let's pick muscular effort by the rider. Okay, so you would just go to question three. Vehicle with 3 wheels or vehicle with 2 wheels? And I think they left off one, right? There should be a vehicle with 1 wheel. You know, or actually what would happen here if they were doing that is they would say vehicle with 3 wheels, vehicle with less than 3 wheels, and then there would be another question, vehicle with 2 wheels or vehicle with 1 wheel. So to keep with the couplet, that's what they would have to do. And so rather obviously you can identify a motorcycle, an automobile, or a bicycle using this kind of key. The same thing is done with the fish keys. And in fact, you can do an exercise and make your own fish keys if you find something interesting, an interesting species that needs to be identified in an area. If you're trying to help people at a park or something like that, you can make your own dichotomies. Okay, so now I've got a little, just a primer on fish families in South Texas. There are so many fish to talk about that I thought the best way to do is just to tell you about the different families of fish that we have here. And just, I'll give you a couple of key features about them. And see if you can remember some of those when you're looking yourself at fish. And if you just remember a couple of key features and get down to family, you can easily find a key or something online to help you identify it. The hard part is trying to narrow it down to a group of fish in order to identify it. So one of the first fish in this group are the stingrays, or Dasyatidae. This includes everything with a stinger, including the southern stingray, Atlantic stingray, things like that. So if it's got a whip tail and it's got a stinger, it's probably in this family. Lepisosteidae, which are gars. We have two major species here, the alligator gar and the spotted gar. And they can get quite large. These are in all the local resakas. People love to eat them, and I have some funny stories about going and trying to find them and net up other species in local resakas in the middle of Brownsville, and people are like, "Are you from the fish market or from the restaurant?" And we're like, "No." Why? Like, "Oh, they usually come here to catch the fish." Okay. Which restaurant was that? Okay, Elopidae is a group also called the 10-pounders, which include the ladyfish, and then you've also got family Megalopidae. Okay, so you remember Lopidae, which are the tarpon. Okay, these are very actually closely related, actually. And another species that has the same origin as these are the eels, or I guess the group are the eels, because these all have what are called leptocephalus larvae. They have this big translucent larva that doesn't really have a mouth, and they travel huge distances, and you find them, they look like a worm, and then they finally metamorphose and start getting scales after months of being at sea. But they're really amazing creatures, and if you get a chance, you should look up a YouTube video of leptocephalus eel larvae to see. I mean, the moray eel ones can be this long and can already have translucent teeth. And there's a video of a guy filming one on a reef, but just to see what a leptocephalus larva looks like and how long they stay at sea, they're just amazing. And the one interesting story about these groups, and especially eel leptocephalus larvae, is that, of course, Japanese love to eat eel, and so they always want to try to aquaculture the eel, but it's really, really complicated. You can't figure out how to grow them from their leptocephalus form into the juvenile, and so usually they just capture them as they're migrating back to the water bodies and capture them as juveniles. And so the only thing that they could find so far that could have them, let them catch leptocephalus larvae, or hatch them from eggs, and grow them all the way forward, was using shark egg extract. Now, the problem with that is you'd have a discussion with the shark biologists about that, because how many shark eggs can you get to grow eels for humans to consume? And that's the conundrum they have now. Hopefully they can synthesize a protein or something in there and make it in the lab rather than having to use shark eggs. But when I saw that paper come out, I'm like, this is not good. You know, we already have shark fin soup, and now we use shark eggs to grow eels. And so that gets us to the eels. So freshwater eels are in the family Anguillidae, okay, and these are very, very interesting creatures as well. We do have them on the southern Texas coast, but not in high numbers, probably because the Rio Grande is not what it once was. But these actually make really long migrations from the Sargasso Sea from both sides of the Atlantic, right? Some go back to Europe, some come to North America, South America, and actually migrate from that spawning area as leptocephalus larvae back to their natal grounds, or nursery grounds in freshwater. They actually go up waterfalls and all kinds of crazy migrations similar to what salmon do. And in fact, they're starting to make passageways for them in areas where they block them off from going back to their nursery areas because they realize they've done that. Okay, snake eels and moray eels are in the Opictidae group, but they also have leptocephalus larvae, so I think an eel you could probably narrow down fairly quickly, because it's a pretty easy to nail down the features of an eel and say, I think that's what that is.
Looks like a snake to me, I mean, you know?
Yeah, it looks like a snake eel, yeah, and these are actually occur quite commonly in the Caribbean. And the bright yellow spots.
Well, how can you tell the difference between an eel and a snake?
Well, fortunately in that area we don't have sea snakes, but they do look remarkably like sea snakes. These guys won't be coming up to the surface to gulp air. They don't have a very keeled tail, and they won't kill you if they bite you instantly. Well, sea snakes are some of the most venomous snakes in the world, but these morays, I think the way they move too, the sea snakes swim in the water column typically when they're hunting, and these guys are mostly on the bottom. So, family Angrulidae are the anchovies. Anchovies are in really high abundance in the coastal zone, especially in the summertime. And if you catch some of these little silver ones, or you get one in your swimsuit when you're swimming, an easy way to distinguish them is they have a bulbous nose and a fleshy snout. And that's how I tell them apart from the other silvery fishes very quickly. Because they always have a kind of a silvery line and nondescript features, but they always have a fleshy nose that you can push in. So family Cyprinidae or minnows, these are solely freshwater species. They're also silvery fish. They can be quite colorful in the reproductive season in all of our rivers. They're very abundant in North America because it's actually basses and crappie and cyprinid minnows are the most abundant freshwater species we have in North America. The Rio Grande silvery minnow is actually one that is threatened in the Rio Grande. It only occurs up north as it goes from New Mexico down south, and actually they take out all the Rio Grande silvery minnows they can find and put them in an impoundment whenever the ice melts or the snow melts and there's no more water flowing, because if they don't, these things will probably go extinct. It's crazy how threatened they are. And it's because these fish actually have pelagic eggs that float, and they float downriver and they hatch and then they swim back. And since we dam the river in many places, that mode of reproduction just does not work in the Rio Grande anymore. So they don't really make it past Falcon Dam, and in fact, quite far north of there, they're extirpated as well. We do have one relative to the piranha. In the Rio Grande Valley, we have family Characidae. Okay, and these are called Mexican tetras. So if you catch a silvery fish in a cast net or something in a resaca or in the river, and you find out that it's got pointy teeth, there's really only one thing it can be. It's the only toothy fish of this type that we have down here, the only relative of the piranha. Okay, and now we get to catfishes. So there's several different kinds of catfishes we have, but Ictaluridae includes all the bullhead catfishes, channel cats, blue cats, and mud cats, and yellow cats, and things like that. Okay, the freshwater catfishes. And then we also have, of course, saltwater catfishes. If you've ever been fishing at night in the coastal area on the bottom, you're going to catch a saltwater catfish. It's either going to be this guy, the gap-top sail, or the hardhead catfish. Both of them in the family Ariidae. Okay, and then we have our own Armadillo del Rio, which is actually an introduced species. There's actually two different species, but these are sucker-mouth catfishes or armored catfishes from South America that actually been introduced all over the place in the southern states and have taken over. In Florida, they're eroding feet of bank on all these freshwater lakes every year because they actually burrow into the bank, lay their eggs, and guard them there. And so they keep burrowing and burrowing and messing things up. But they were introduced here, so now if you could ask one of these fish, they'd say, hey, I'm from here, right? They've been here for so long. And some of our resacas that we put nets out, we'll catch 100 of them. They're just so successful. They can gulp air. They don't care if it gets hot and deoxygenated water. They're still hanging around. And they're probably most likely released from aquarium trade. Like when you get an aquarium fish, gets too big for your aquarium, I'm just going to throw it in the resaca. Don't want it anymore, don't want to kill it. That's what happens. We actually have salmon here in the Rio Grande Valley. Actually a rainbow trout in the family Salmonidae. These were actually put, there's actually, you can actually look and find a place to buy a rainbow trout tag down here in the Rio Grande Valley, because for some time they would actually put them in the wintertime for people to, winter Texans, to catch their rainbow trout out of the resacas, and then of course they would die when the temperatures got too warm. But there are still tags you can buy. I'm not sure if there's any place down here they're really stocking them anymore, but it is in the checklist. Okay, this is the fish that thinks it's a bird, family Mugulidae, or the mullets. This fish actually has a gizzard, has a beak. It likes to jump through or fly through the air when it's jumping, and it's very Euryhaline. You can find them in most freshwater rivers and all along the coast. The interesting thing about them is that in Florida they're very good to eat. There's plenty of roadside places and restaurants where you can buy smoked mullet, and it's some of the finest white fish you can find. They're very tender, very tasty. Well, myself included, and a lot of my friends that have come over here from being in Florida, you try to catch one here, it looks like it might be good, it tastes like mud. We have a lot more blue-green algae in our sediments here, a lot more sediment outflows, no freshwater springs, not very much freshwater input, so we get fish like this one that tastes like mud. Okay, another silvery fish that you can find in both fresh and saltwater environments are the Thenarapsidae, which are the silver sides. And the reason they call them silver sides is because they don't have a lateral line and they have a really, really bright silver stripe on the side of them. If you catch a fish in a freshwater or a saltwater environment that has a big shiny silver side and it's, looks like a little minnow, it's going to be a silver sides, hence the name. These are fish that they've actually stocked into lakes for prey species, but they also occur in high abundance in rivers and also off in the coastal zone in big numbers. Okay, and now we have the toothy fish in the saltwater environment. So this is family Balonidae, or needlefishes. Okay, they have big teeth. They look kind of like a gar. You'll find them in the lights at night, swimming around, really narrow, and finding them darting after other fish. If you go to a fishing pier or a dock at night, you'll typically find these right outside the lights, ready to rush in to eat anything that's ventured out. The big cousin of this is called the houndfish, and in fact, scuba divers have to beware of these because they jet towards light coming straight into their eyes, and so if you're diving at night and you have a dive light, if you shine it right at the surface, there have been reports of scuba divers being impaled by these things because they have the houndfish gets about 4 feet long and can swim really fast, and so it'll come right towards the light, so you gotta be careful. Okay, and then we have some other really complex species or group of fish here called the Pisciliidae, or live bearers. These actually occur in freshwater and brackish environments. In fact, you can find them in the Birdia Center, you can find them in resacas, you can find them in the Rio Grande. But there are about, I think, 300 different species of these in North and South and Central America, and they actually bear live young. So very interesting species. We've done some behavioral research on them, and in fact, this is a large sailfin molly male, and you can see he's got a big flag with a bunch of spots on there that are actually can actually transmit UV light or reflect it back, and so he actually displays to a harem of females and woos them into reproducing with him. There are other species that have taken an alternative tactic where the males are really small and they dart in and reproduce with the females. So there's any number of behaviors with them and reproductive strategies, and they've been able to adapt to all different kinds of extreme environments in freshwater and saltwater. Okay, probably one of the most extremophiles of fish are the pup fishes, the Cyprinodontidae. These fish are the ones that can handle 100-degree Fahrenheit water. They can handle seawater 4 times its strength. They can handle fresh water. They're just all around extremophiles. They don't swim very fast and they get eaten quite often, but if you give them an extreme environment, they do very well. And so the killifishes and the pup fishes are in this group of Cyprinodontidae. And then one of my favorites, family Centropomidae. Okay, the snooks. We've got 2 major groups down here in South Texas. We have the common snook, which gets up to about 4 feet long. We've got the fat snook, which gets about 2 feet long. And they're very hard to tell apart for fishermen. I'm actually doing a study right now to see if they actually overlap in their behavior and the environments they occupy, because the fat snook very rarely reaches the fishing limit or the legal limit to keep it. And so all of these fish are running around reproducing where we're harvesting the ones that we really want all the time. So hopefully we'll have the results of that study in about 1.5 years, and we'll be able to say whether or not these fish do overlap. Maybe they need to lower the fishing, the legal limit. Okay, one of the most abundant groups in freshwater are the centrarchids, or sunfishes. These include sunfish, crappie, and bass. So any bass species that you find, smallmouth, largemouth. There's several bass that only occur in specific rivers in Texas. These are in the family Centrarchidae. And in North America, this is the dominant predator fish species in freshwater lakes.
Yeah.
It's, yeah.
I'm sorry. Does the perch come into that area or not?
Well, sometimes these are called perch. So I guess in a freshwater lake in North America, unless you're way up north where they actually have the yellow perch,
Yeah.
which is it's a completely different body. But if it's got a pan, they also call them panfish.
Yeah.
So if it looks like that, it's a centrarchid, which is a sunfish.
Oh.
Okay. So bluegill, which
Yeah.
is one they mostly call, which is the one you probably most commonly
Yeah.
catch, is in this group as well. But it's amazing how many different species we have in North America, and you get just into Central America, and then it becomes cichlids. Okay, well, everything down there, the peacock bass is actually a cichlid. Okay, which brings us to cichlids. We have one native cichlid here, which is a Rio Grande cichlid. It actually has some pearl stripe or pearl spots on it, and very beautiful. If you go to Gladys Porter Zoo, they've got a couple on display that are really, really beautiful adults. But we have another cichlid that's been introduced called the blue tilapia. And it looks, when it's young, it looks very similar. When it gets older, this is an adult male. They actually are quite pretty, but they actually come from Africa. And they've been stocked here. They're able to withstand like densities of 1 fish per liter in an aquaculture system. And so when you go and eat tilapia at a restaurant, these are aquacultured fish that have been kept in really, really high densities. And probably this species or one other that they're mainly culturing. We find more of these than we do these now when we do electrofishing in the local resakas because they're just so prolific. And they're like, hey, you got really hot water, no oxygen, it's turbid, we're good.
I've heard that the tilapia is the worst fish you can eat because they're so dirty.
I don't know if it's the worst fish you can eat. You have to think about it in terms of how many density, how much they're putting it in terms of pressure on local species and things like that when it comes to fishing. They're actually quite good because they're aquaculture. However, if you go to this is another story you probably don't want to go. Any restaurant that you go to and you get the fish platter, what do you think you're getting?
The tilapia.
Well,
I don't know.
no, even different than that, you're probably getting a fish called basa.
Yeah.
Okay, and basa is from the family Pangasincidae, which is a Chinese catfish. It grows very quickly. It occurs in the Mekong and some other areas, but they culture those, and those are all imported. And so we're getting those at $1 a pound or something wholesale, and they're selling it to you as fried fish. Anywhere on the coast you go, unless you spend like $20 for a plate of fish, you're getting basa. tilapia and some of the common restaurants, you're probably getting that if you just get a freshwater fish. It could be tilapia. In fact, they actually put tilapia on the name because somehow they've been able to make it so it sounds like it's pretty good. But
Dirty L's, that's what they serve. on
Tilapia?
fish. No, that.
Basa.
the
Oh, yeah, Basa
I asked them
served
one
Dirty
time,
L's.
I was so disgusted, I said, I came here for fresh fish and you're serving me this.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's the dirty secret about almost all of the restaurants in the coast or ones that claim to be seafood restaurants, is it's not even a saltwater fish. Yeah. Well, the biggest problem is that one of our biggest trade deficits in the United States is fish and other marine organisms that we're eating. We've tapped out our resources worldwide, and so the only number that's increasing is aquaculture species, because that's what we've done. There are so many of us on Earth that there's not enough fish to go around, even though they thought the resource was unlimited. It's not. So, gotta be choosy about your fish, or maybe,
Sure.
I mean, let's not go into chickens, right?
Yeah.
So another group are the gobies. These are a really interesting group, family Gobiidae, because they're the only ones that have like a sucker apparatus on their belly. So two fins fuse, and they're actually really good at holding on to substrates and flowing water and things like that. And actually, people have studied these to make a better Velcro even, because they actually have almost little hook and loop structures on the sucker itself to hold themselves. And one of the most common ones we have in the fresh and saltwater environments are these naked gobies. They actually have look like tiger stripes. They only get this big. That's crazy. I'll take a group of students into the freshwater environment and catch them, and we'll go to the coast and start seining again, and we'll catch another one. And they're just they're well distributed and very good at living in saltwater or freshwater environments. And another demersal fish, or one that lives on the bottom, is the flounder. And we have two different groups in the saltwater environment. We've got the sand flounders that are left-eyed, and then we also have the right-eyed flounders, the soles. Okay, we don't have any big soles around here. The biggest flounder we have, of course, is a southern flounder. And then we've got a bunch of other ones. If you went with the floating classroom, you'd probably catch a bunch of small flounders, bay whiffs, and other things. These are all left-eyed flounders. And in fact, that eye migrates. They start out swimming in the water column as larvae, and when they get scaled and they finally get all pigmented, that eye actually migrates around to that side. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they accidentally migrate the other way. But by and large, these are all left-eyed flounders. And when I was a student, we were culturing them in Port Aransas, and an interesting thing would happen if there were too many already settled down at the bottom of the tank. They wouldn't settle anymore. They had already migrated their eye, but they realized there were too many down there, and they would die in the water column rather than settle down with too many fish down there. So they know to move to another area when there's already too many flounder. Pretty cool, but also pretty disturbing when you're trying to grow a bunch of flounder. Okay, the soles, as I was saying, are the right-eyed flounders, and we have the line sole and the hog choker. And I guess there was an old story that, if you got your hog out there and it swallows it might die. I don't know, they're all more rounded, and they only get about that big. Okay, and then we've got family Tetraodontidae, the puffers. And so we've got puffers and burrfish and a couple of other species in that group. But if it's a fish that can actually puff up in your hand, it probably belongs to Tetraodontidae. And then we've got family Cyanidae, which are the drums. Okay, and the drums are the most specious group we have on the coastline here. There are so many different ones that we have, and they spawn at different times of the year. You can catch them at different times. Black drum, croaker, whiting, red drum, and spotted sea trout. And you can see these spots can actually proliferate when they're developing, and you can actually get a spotty red drum that's just about as spotty as a trout occasionally. Now, if you really want to impress your friends, if you catch a drum and you're filleting it, you can tell them whether it's a male or a female by looking for a special structure of the sonic muscle that's right up near the air bladder. And they actually flex this muscle and vibrate it really quickly to actually pound on their air bladder to make the drumming sound. So males are the only ones that actually make the noise, and so therefore they're the only ones that actually differentiate this sonic muscle in their body. And then we have porgies. We only have 2 species down here in the group Sparidae, which are the pinfish, and aptly named because if you catch one and you try to hold on to it, it's going to feel like it's sticking you with pins because of all the spines it has, its dorsal spine and its pectoral spines. And we also have, of course, a sheep's head. If anybody fishes in the marine environment, you know, a couple of times a year when they're spawning, you can really catch a whole lot of them. But both of these are actually very closely related. Okay, the groupers, as I mentioned earlier, these are in the group Serranidae, and it's a grab bag of fish that includes these very large groupers, like black groupers, cone groupers, Warsaw groupers, all the way down to rockine, and then a very small species called the belted sandfish. And what's interesting about these is that most of them change sex and have some pretty complex reproductive strategies. In fact, this one's probably the craziest one. It actually it's both sexes at the same time. And if it finds a bigger fish in the day, it will function as one sex. And if it finds a smaller fish later in the day, it will function as the other sex. So they're going to reproduce in the same day as both sexes. Pretty amazing. Okay, family Bliniidae, which is a pretty nondescript fish that you can find all on the coastal area. They're usually in little crevices. You might catch one on the jetty if you're fishing for them. But to determine if you have a blenny or not, you should just look for the eyebrows, because these fish have characteristic eyebrows. They may not be very big, but they always have them right above their eyes, kind of like Bert. And they have these bushy eyebrows, and that's one dead giveaway if you can find them and distinguish them between a goby and a blenny, which would be about the same size. Goby would typically have a sucker with 2 fused fins. This guy would have bushy eyebrows. Okay, and that's all I have for the groups of fish. If you guys would like a copy of that to look at the families of fish, I'd be happy to provide you with it as well. But I want to tell you one more thing before I go, which is I'm also involved in the Rio Grande Valley Reef Project. Friends of the RGV Reef is a nonprofit group that's really putting the muscle into this and getting this done. But this is a 1.2 square mile reefing area. The Texas coast. It's the largest reef by like 5-fold of any reef on the Texas coastline. We negotiated to get several reefing spots for it. And it has all this material here, and actually all of this and this actually came from a TxDOT project. Roofing tile material, which is a low profile nursery habitat, a lot of concrete, and mainly concrete, some steel. And now concrete railroad ties, 100 train cars full of them being placed on the reef. And this is probably the crowning jewel of the reef right now, which is the 4,000-ton tile. It's 9 million pounds of these concrete railroad ties. Or, let's see, they can only take 200 tons of boatload. So it's at 20 boatloads of these made this now 32-foot tall pile of concrete railroad ties. It's a couple hundred feet in diameter, and it's just going to be a very interesting feature out there, kind of like a seamount. And no one's really done one of these on the Texas coast before, so we'll see what happens. It's already a really good fishing spot, but we're hoping to see pelagics show up. It might be an interesting spawning area for some species of fish, because some fish are adapted to these areas where the currents get really disturbed because of high-rise pinnacles. So we'll see what happens with that. But if you want to know more about it, you can go to the Friends of RGV website, where they've got updates all the time on what's happening out here. All right, so that's all I've got for you. Like I said, I'd be happy to share the PowerPoint if you want to look more into the fish. Yes.
You mentioned the dead zone in the Gulf. What could you tell a little more about that?
Well, so there are several dead zones and naturally occurring as well, just not as big as they are now. And the biggest one in the world is off of the Mississippi coast, right? So right off of It's actually not off the state of Mississippi, it's actually off of Louisiana, going towards Texas, out of the mouth of the Mississippi. And during the summer, when the water gets really warm, where you get stratification, we also have all of the fertilizers that have run off the fields running down the Mississippi during periods of high rain. And the bacteria and other plankton just go berserk, reproduce, and as we said, anything that's photosynthesizing is going to be using up oxygen at night. But you've also got bacteria and other plankton that don't photosynthesize eating this stuff, and they're also consuming all the oxygen. So you end up with this area on the bottom that moves around that may have no oxygen in it. And it just passes over an area, and all the worms and all the invertebrates die because they run out of oxygen. And then after that, it can be a feeding frenzy for other fish that move into the area, but if the area gets too big, it kind of wipes out everything. And that's the big concern, is that this area is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's bigger than some states in size every year. And a hurricane can come and mix it all up and make it so it's not so stratified, but if we don't get one in one year and it's really hot, we get this huge dead area that can really cause a problem. Off of many of the population centers on Earth now, there are dead zones because of all the extra effluent that's being put into the water and all the extra fertilizer that runs into the river. So if there's one thing that we can advocate for, it's don't use any more fertilizer than you absolutely have to on these crops, because that's mainly what it is. It's phosphorus and nitrogen that's being put into the water.
Thank you.